in the state of Georgia. But digging into that even more, record youth voter turnout as well. It's estimated that 21% of the voter turnout in the state of Georgia was young voters. Compare that to 17% of national voters being young voters. Record-setting figures once again in Georgia, this time with the youth vote. Well, that's largely thanks to many groups working on the ground, not just in 2020, but over the course of many years, working around voter engagement. And one of the groups working towards young voter engagement is Georgia Shift. Joining us now, we have Ian Bridgeworth, who is the founder and the executive director of Georgia Shift. Welcome, Ian. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I laid out some of the statistics there, 21% of the overall vote in Georgia being the youth vote. That's at least 4% ahead of the national average. Put that into context. How big are those numbers? What does that mean for young voters coming out in such large numbers in the state of Georgia?
What I think it means is that there's a mandate to engage young people and not only during elections, but year round, because young people are going to make their voice heard and make sure that they're coming out, and they need, like these elected officials and politicians need to be held accountable because they wouldn't be in office without young people.
Take us through your particular organization, because your Twitter statement reads, "We give marginalized young people a seat at the table of democracy." And I mean, to me, that says you're doing a lot more than just registering young people to vote. It's a lot deeper than that.
Yeah, so our vision is where we have young people of color, particularly young Black and brown people, be the fundamental driver of political impact and public policy at every level of government in an unbridled democracy. And so the idea with that is that young people are the ones who are making a political impact, but they're the ones who are driving public policy in like every level of government and making sure that the democracy that they engage in is unleashed, whether that's making sure that there's no voter suppression, making sure that there's accessible city council meetings and county commission meetings and all these different things like that. And so some of these things happen at the local level, some things happen at the state level, to make sure that how do we make sure our democracy is accessible as possible, and that young people are going to be the ones who make sure that happens.
And do you think the two main political parties, if we just look at the context of the presidential election, do you think they have done enough to actually reach out and not just assume young people will come out and vote for them, but then to have them included in the entire political process and then in the decision making going forward?
Yeah, so I'm gonna say I don't think the parties can do can never do enough as far as engaging young people. I think it has to be a relationship building process to where how do you make sure that young people are not only at every step of the process, but they're the ones leading and in that process and saying, hey, yes, young people voted at record turnout. Now, how are you going to include young people in your agenda? How do you make sure that young people are a priority in your agenda, and that if young people aren't priority, the young people are going to make sure that they hold you accountable and change that. And so I think that's to me the biggest thing is that, like, young people are the ones who got them there, and now it's time to make sure that these elected officials and the parties give something to young people and make sure that young people get what they turned out for.
It sounds like they need to be held accountable.
Yes.
If they want people to come and vote for them and young people to come out and vote for them, then they need to be held accountable going forward.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we'd love to hear from you, our viewers. If you have a question or a comment, do leave it in the Facebook comment area there, and we'll incorporate that into the conversation. But Ian, of course, election season is not over for you folks in Georgia. The rest of the country might be able to take a step back from all of that. But the Senate runoff is coming up in early January, and that's really significant. 2 Senate seats at play that could completely change the balance of power in the Senate. And if we continue our look at the youth vote and the potential impact of that on the Senate runoff seats, 23,000 young people will turn 18 and become eligible to vote between the general election and the Senate runoff. There have been so many efforts in Georgia to really transform the voting process. in response to the overt voter suppression that you have been experiencing there for many, many years. But one of the transformative things seems to be the automatic voter registration. So remind our viewers exactly what that is and how you almost have to opt out, right? And how this is connected to getting a driver's license. And we'll talk about what that impact could be on the youth vote.
Yeah. So when you go get your license, there's a line in the application or in the document that allows you to register to vote, and essentially it'll automatically opt you in if you, and you can opt out, but most people don't opt out. And so it increases a huge amount of young people being able to get registered and get in the system in that way. They're already one step ahead of getting involved in the voting process. And so essentially the next thing you do is either find out when you can vote in person or request an absentee ballot. And it just makes that process so much easier than what we had 4 or 5 years ago. And so I think that's the biggest, one of the biggest things that's been helpful to make sure that we increase youth vote turnout, is that we eliminate that huge step of voter registration and making sure that they're on the rolls and those kinds of things. And so I think now it's one, there's also still need to be accountability to making sure all these young people who have been registered, that they stay on the rolls and that they're not being taken off.
Well, what is happening now between now and the runoff election in early January, given that there's a global pandemic, that, there are a lot of pressures right now on young people and in colleges, and, what kind of activism is happening now ahead of the Senate runoff election to really engage young voters? Because as we've been discussing, it's not just a simple matter of registering someone to vote. There's a whole lot more engagement that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think the turnout showed in November showed that young people are excited and they want to go vote and make sure that their voice is heard and that they let people know where they are, that they're here and that they're here to stay in this election. So with this runoff, one of the things I think is big is making sure there's a lot of education around how do we make sure that people know like where they can vote, when they can vote, how they can vote, make sure they request their absentee ballot as early as possible. And I think particularly even with campuses are sort of in a weird space now where some campuses are in person, some campuses are closing, those kinds of things. And so I think what we've done is built out a campus network, about 13 campuses. And what we do is we work with the schools and administrators and people who work at the schools to say, hey, we know your students want to get involved. How do we work together to make sure that we can disseminate this information as quickly as possible? And so we've worked with partners and things like TurboVote, Vote.org, those kinds of things to make sure that young people have access to everything that they need to go vote. I think, one of the things that people will say, and there's a stereotype that young people are apathetic, but it's not. That is the fact that, you know, young people want to come out. It's just we need to make sure that we're giving them the information that they need. And so, I joke all the time. It's like, I can't get mad at you for not coming out to an event if I don't tell you about it. And so we're making sure that we're contacting them early and often, and making sure that they have everything they need to go vote, whether that's through an absentee ballot or in person, knowing their early voting locations. In Georgia, we have 159 different counties, and so all of those counties have different early voting locations. We want to make sure that they have everything that they need to go vote.
Do you think that there's a tendency to think of the youth vote as a monolith? That it's all college students and all the college students are having the exact same life experience, and that all they're concerned about are student loans, which I know, of course, is a major issue, but there's so much more nuance to that. And particularly in communities that would not necessarily have students coming from a long line of, higher education within their families. There are so many other challenges facing these students in terms of engaging them as voters, but also the issues that they're really concerned about when they're casting their votes.
Yeah, so I think, to that point, a lot of people think about young people as like these fratty college students and doing beer kegs and those kinds of things. But, there are a lot of young people, particularly the young people of color, the young Black and brown people we work with, their parents, their caretakers, they are aunts and uncles and these kinds of things, and they're taking care of their families, and they're dealing with real and serious issues day in and day out. I think one of the things that was huge was with COVID, where either people lost their jobs or their hours were cut. And so it's like, with these issues, it's like, how do we make sure that as an organization we're not just saying, hey, go vote, because it falls flat. It's like, well, what are you actually doing for me in my life? Because I have 2.5 jobs, I have childcare issues and those kinds of things. And so it's like, how are you actually engaging me in a way that that affects my life and is impacting my life in a positive way. And so one of the things that we're working with is engaging not only like voter education and voter turnout, but also direct services and helping to either provide food or food banks and those kinds of things, or directing them to other places that they can get the things that they need, particularly around the holidays, where one, because of COVID, most people can't travel and be around the family like they used to, but also like people are still hurting, what is this, I guess 8 months into this pandemic and those kinds of things, because essentially we only got $1,200 back in March or April or whatever, and some people didn't even get that $1,200. There are a lot of particularly undocumented individuals who never got anything, and so it's like, how do we have to come to them and say, hey, what value do we provide to young people, and then making sure that we're engaging them before we even talk about voting or absentee ballots or those kinds of things.
We're speaking today with Ian Bridgeworth, who's the executive director and the founder of Georgia Shift, a non-partisan nonprofit in the state of Georgia that's working to mobilize and engage youth voters in that state. If you've a question or a comment, do leave it here under our Facebook Live segment, and we'll certainly incorporate that into the conversation. Ian, Georgia has so many historically Black colleges and universities, and we touched on it a little bit earlier about how there has been real attempts to disenfranchise and essentially purge voter rolls in the state of Georgia. So much of the activism around voter engagement in the last few years has really been in response to that. So, when you have communities of colour specifically being targeted by that, but then you also have students of colour who have not also had an easy time in getting to the polls. How does that play out? What does disenfranchisement look like for youth voters and youth voters of colour? What are some of those conversations happening, particularly at the historically Black colleges and universities?
Yes, I think particularly now, and even during the election, November election, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation happening, and there's some from malicious sources, some from people who are meaning well, but they just are sending off the wrong things. And so, with us, I think it's making sure that, particularly young people of color, wherever they are, like, how do we make sure that we're providing them credible information and saying, hey, here's a link to find out where you're registered, if you're registered at an old address, those kinds of things, to either change your registration. And so I think with us, it's engaging them and being that trusted messenger to say, hey, like, we know there's a lot of information happening right now, whether Instagram is telling you to do this or SoundCloud is telling you to do this. Like, here's a link that you can see where you're registered, all those, where you can get an absentee ballot, where your sample ballot is. And so I think it's really being proactive and just making sure that they have everything they need, and reaching them directly, and trying to say, like, just give them that information. In that way, they feel comfortable either requesting an absentee ballot or going to go vote.
What are you hearing from students about their own experience, either as young voters, but also maybe coming from communities that themselves have, suffered from voter suppression and from voter marginalization? Because so often, our experience with this is what our parents experienced, what our grandparents experienced. And, I'd imagine many of these young voters are coming from families that have experienced generations of voter suppression, and also that feeling of being disenfranchised from the entire democratic process.
Yeah, I think for some it can be a little demoralizing, but I think there's when you engage young people and say, hey, like, we understand that there's systems in place to try to keep you from voting, and but we want to make sure that you have everything that you need. I think they're like, okay, well, I can find out here. And I think their biggest issue is getting the information from a credible source, but making sure that, like, they know exactly where to go, and it fits also with their schedule, right? So, like, a lot of students are parents, and a lot of people who may not be students, or people who they may have not gotten even a high school degree or those kinds of things. Like, we want to make sure that we're reaching as many of those people as possible, because their voice matters just as much as whether students or graduate students or whatever. And so I think what they're saying is that they want to vote and they're excited to vote, and we want to make sure that they have a source, and they have a trusted source of information to go to, say, hey, I have no idea where my early voting location is, and then we want to be there as early and as quick as possible to make sure that they get that information.
Well, as we said, the very important Senate runoff election happening, 2 Senate seats at play, 23,000 young voters in Georgia now eligible to vote who weren't eligible in the general election. So Ian, just as we finish up, how can people find out more about your organization and youth voter engagement in the state of Georgia?
Sure. So they can go to georgiashift.org. That's Georgia spelled out, SHIFT.org. We are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all /Georgia Shift. You can find us there. There are multiple ways to get involved. We're looking to send out hundreds of thousands of texts and reach. We're looking to reach about 100,000 unique young voters between now and January. And so we would love all the help that your viewers would like to provide.
Well, Ian Bridgeworth is the executive director and the founder of Georgia Shift. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And next Wednesday, join us at the same time for further discussion about what is happening in the state of Georgia in the run-up to this very important Senate runoff election. And we're going to be talking with the group All Voting is Local Georgia. That's next Wednesday, same time right here. For Free Speech TV and Democracy on the Brink, I'm Maeve Conran. Thanks so much for joining us.